Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Coming up a little bit later in the show, we'll take a tour of Timespan Museum in Scotland. But first, our guest joining us now is the Concordia College Associate Professor of English, Amy Watkins. Amy, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
As we get started, we always like to let the guests or the audience know. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I grew up just south of town in Christine, North Dakota, but was raised primarily in Fargo. I have degrees in English from NDSU and UND. Yeah, I've been teaching literature ever since.
Yeah.
Teach some, my expertise is in British literature and women's writing primarily.
Well, how did you end up at Concordia?
While I was in grad school, I worked part-time at pretty much every college in the area, and was lucky enough to find a full-time position at Concordia before I finished my degree.
Well, let's talk about a few projects you've done, maybe, and give some more background for people. First, tell us some of the books that you've written.
I wrote a number of books for a series called How to Write About Literature. I wrote on Mary Shelley, I wrote on Charles Dickens, Oscar Wilde, Harper Lee, and I'm forgetting somebody, Jane Austen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then you mentioned Mary Shelley, and so let's talk about this book, How to Write About Mary Shelley. What fascinated you about the author of Frankenstein?
I'm fascinated with women writers in general, particularly those who wrote when it was less popular, perhaps, for women to be writing. I think Mary Shelley is unique because she's credited with starting the science fiction genre with Frankenstein, and she was only 18 years old when she started writing the book. And her whole story is unique too, with her famous parents and her famous husband and some of the trials that she went through. So she had a fascinating life.
Well, with that said, in her lifetime, and of course, you mentioned her husband. Let's talk about her husband for just a minute. Of course, he was more famous maybe in his day, but that may not be the case now. But talk about some of that.
Well, Percy Shelley, her husband, was famous in their lifetime, partly because of her, actually. I should say in her lifetime, because he died very young. But after he died, she made sure that his works got published, and she's part of the reason that he's still as famous as he is. They had quite a scandalous life together. They met when she was 16. He was about 5 years older than she was, and left his pregnant wife for her. And yeah, just a couple of years later, she had a baby. His wife actually committed suicide, and they were able to get married finally. But a lot of tragedy, a lot of very risque things to be doing, even today. But back then, of course, very scandalous.
Again, I mentioned Frankenstein, of course. Why does Frankenstein endure in literature?
I think there are a lot of ways to answer that question. One of the primary reasons, I would say, is because it leaves us with more questions than answers. She's talking about some big issues. She's talking about God and what happens when man tries to play God, what happens when there is what we would call technology or science. They would have called natural philosophy. What happens when you do things just because you can, but maybe they're not morally correct. She's asking questions about gender, about parenting. Frankenstein, of course, is the doctor in the book, not the monster, although we know Frankenstein as the monster. And creates this creature and then abandons him. So what happens in the role of a parent and the role of nurturing and that kind of thing. So she's asking a lot of difficult questions.
Well, what were the challenges in writing this book or books like this? Because you said you've done a few.
I think In this book, it was a little more focused because I got to write about only Frankenstein. Some of the other books I was writing about more of the author's works. So I think partly reading the novel and reading it well enough to find questions that are interesting and deep so that students can spend quite a bit of time researching. The book is primarily directed at students to just kind of give them some ideas, not to do the work for them, but to give them some ideas on themes and characterization and some of the issues that come up in the book.
Well, have you heard back from students who benefited from you writing this book?
A few, actually. I was lucky enough to have a colleague use this particular book, the Mary Shelley volume, last semester. And I heard back from his students who had benefited. I have some students in most of these volumes. There is a student essay in there, so a Concordia student makes an appearance in each of the volumes as well. So every now and then they come and tell me they came across the book in the library and used it and found it helpful. So that's nice.
How long has this book been out?
Boy, I can't remember exactly. 5 years maybe,
Okay.
4 or 5 years.
But, okay, well then can you talk about the writing style of Shelley's? I mean, some people say they have a hard time reading Frankenstein because of the style it was written in.
Well, I think you have to give yourself time to get used to the style. A little bit different vocabulary, maybe different syntax, just a different way of speaking and writing than we use today, but not so far off that you can't kind of find the groove and you know, get into it eventually. Yeah, I think if people just stick with it and maybe are willing to take it slowly and give it some thought. It's not the kind of book you can really race through, but if you really think about what you're reading, it's pretty terrifying, actually. Frankenstein is a pretty scary book.
Okay. Well, let's turn to a new project you're working on, and it's writing a book about Oscar Wilde's wife, Constance. Right. Tell us about this project and how far along are you on it?
I am finished with the draft. Still revising here and there, but I'm beginning the search for an agent, and then after that a publisher. So I'm pretty excited to be that far along.
Well, with that said, can you tell us who was Constance Wilde?
Well, obviously it could fill a whole book. She was a young woman in the late Victorian period, so the second half of the 19th century. She was born in 1858 in London, spent almost her entire life in London. She was very intelligent, very astute. She went to college in as much as a woman could go at the time. She couldn't take a degree, but she took courses. In fact, she took courses on Shelley. One of her favorite writers was Percy Shelley. She was very avant-garde. She was very kind of risky in some of her choices. She wore things like the divided skirt, which to us would look like a skirt, but to them was a pretty big deal, made a big statement. She was interested in art and literature. She was a part of many women's organizations, political organizations. She fought for women's rights her whole life. She was a writer herself, and would eventually marry Oscar Wilde and have 2 young boys, and go on to have a certain number of adventures with him as well. She may have also had an affair of her own to add to the complications of their marriage. Yeah.
Well, with that said, tell us a little bit, for people who may not know, a little bit about Oscar Wilde, the writer, and then the scandal that may have ruined his life with his boyfriend.
Right. Oscar Wilde was an Irish writer. He's best known for his plays, The Importance of Being Earnest, An Ideal Husband, A Woman of No Importance. But he also wrote novels, or a novel. He wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray, and he wrote some nonfiction and quite a lot of poetry as well. And he was very, very popular in his day. He was an international star, I guess you would say. But in 1895, through a long, complicated series of trials, it came out that Oscar Wilde was gay, and partly he was brought into those trials because of his boyfriend at the time, whose nickname was Bosie, and Oscar went to prison for 2 years, hard labor, for what they called gross indecency, which is a very vague law that was in place in England actually until 1967. But that was the harshest punishment you could receive.
Yeah. Well, maybe tell us a little bit about their marriage. Some say Constance was in the dark about his homosexuality. Others say she knew about it when she married him. Were you able to discover anything, or did you read between the lines and figure something out? Or
that is a big part of the reason why my book is historical fiction, because we have questions like that remain unanswered through their letters or any documentation that we have on them. We don't know for sure, but I believe that she fell somewhere in between, I think. She didn't know when they were married, but learned somewhere along the way, and maybe was unwilling or unable to quite admit it to herself or to anyone else until he finally went to trial and they could no longer deny that that's what was happening. But their marriage itself was actually a roller coaster. I think outside of that fact, they might have had struggles even without that. So within the first 2 years of marriage, they had 2 kids, and a lot of issues. Oscar was gone a lot. Constance had ambitions beyond staying home, and they struggled quite a lot. So it was a real roller coaster.
Yeah. Well, what kind of research did you have to do for this book, and where all did you find it?
Lots of libraries around the world, letters. Constance's letter, Oscar's letters are mostly published. Constance's are not. So finding those, digging those up from libraries. I actually had 2 Concordia students work with me last summer full-time for 2 months on research. So they were looking up everything from the weather to what they ate. In fact, we cooked a couple of meals using 19th century recipes, trying to figure out how that would go. It didn't turn out very well. Their stuff did, mine didn't. Yeah, so they got down to the nitty-gritty and looked up. You know, we tried to find pictures of people that she knew, and they created an enormous map of London with every place that she went or frequented. So we did a lot of work, but I credit my students with most of it.
Well, you talked about it just a little bit, but she endured a lot. Can you talk a little about maybe her ailments, and then what was it really like raising kids without the father around?
Yeah. She, Constance suffered physically quite a lot. She had headaches and pains in her arms and her legs. She called it rheumatism or neuralgia. Her grandson, they have one surviving grandson, he recently wrote a paper saying he and a doctor have determined they think she actually had MS. So she suffered physically quite a bit, and by the end of her life was largely unable to get out of bed. She couldn't write letters anymore. She had to type them. So she struggled physically quite a lot. In terms of raising the kids, you know, she only lived for a couple of years after Oscar went to prison. She died quite young. But she had to move her family out of England. She figured that would be, her family kind of pushed her to do it, and she figured that would be safer for the boys, who at the time were only about 8 and 9 years old when Oscar went to prison. So she moved them to the continent, to Switzerland, and eventually to Italy. She sent them to school in Germany. She changed their name. She went back to one of her old family names, Holland, which her grandson still uses, and tried to dissociate them from Oscar, although I contend that she was in love with him until the very end of her life. she knew that it would perhaps be best if the publicity didn't follow her boys around their whole lives. So difficult for her.
Well, can you tell us some of the organizations she was a part of?
Yeah, she was part of the Ladies National Association, which worked to elect females to city council and various positions. It didn't always work, but they tried. She was, the organization I think she felt most strongly about was called the Rational Dress Society. And they worked to make clothing for everyone, but mainly for women and children, more practical, more useful, with the idea that basically if women could just move more freely, they could accomplish more things. So she didn't wear a corset. Her clothing was quite loose. I told you about the divided skirt. One of the contentions of the Rational Dress Society was that women should not have to wear 7 pounds of undergarments, if you can imagine. High heels for women they thought were dangerous on cobblestone streets and things like that. So it sounds frivolous, but actually it was quite important and quite meaningful at the time.
Yeah, well now Constance was a writer in her own right. Can you tell us more about that?
She wrote mainly stories for children, a couple of kind of rewritten fairy tales and a couple that she invented on her own. She also published reviews of plays and other people's writing. And she wrote articles on dress. She edited the newsletter for the Rational Dress Society. And she wrote articles about decorating. Their home was very famous for the way that it was decorated. They lived in a very bohemian artists' enclave, sort of. And she decorated very minimally, which was quite unusual at the time. So she wrote about how to do that, and people took a lot of advice from her.
Well, you know, how has the world changed since Constance's time? For women, is what I'm asking.
Right. You know, that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, actually, because the world has changed so much, and yet I think in some ways so little since her time. Obviously, women have more rights. Constance would be very pleased that women can vote and work and do all of the things that we do now. The way that she raised her children was to be more of a hands-on parent and you know, be down on the floor playing with them when she could, spend more time with them, which was unusual at the time, but more typical today. So I think she would be very pleased, and yet a lot of her struggles still continue. I think a lot of people can still relate to her story and what she went through in her relationships, but also in her work life, trying to balance children and working outside the home and those kinds of things.
Okay. Well, Amy, we look forward to when the book's out. So
Yeah.
we're out of time, so thank you so much
Great.
for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Stay tuned for more. The Timespan Museum in Helmsdale, Scotland is a place to learn about the history of Scottish ancestors who were uprooted from their homes and eventually traveled to regions throughout Manitoba, Canada. The effects of their agricultural knowledge can still be seen in today's farming techniques.
The museum itself tells the story of the clearances and emigration from here. It also tells the story of the sea fishing, the herring boom here, and also river fishing, the Kildonan gold rush, and also our earlier history in the prehistory, Helmsdale Castle, and all the prehistory that there is. I mean, people have been settled and farming and living in this area for at least 6,000 years. the Highland clearance is a cog in a much bigger machine, if in a way. The landowners found it far more profitable to turn the land to sheep farming than the original small farming tenants that they had had there before that. There wasn't enough room on this land for the sheep and the people. So at that time, there was a movement to remove the small farming tenants from these inland straths. And Strath of Kildonan got hit really hard, and the majority received notices of removing from the landowners. And it must have been quite a traumatic time. There are many thousands of footings, we call them, of these longhouses and other buildings associated with the townships. Now, because the houses were taken down for the incoming sheep farmers, because it didn't make sense to have these houses around when you needed the land. So today, what you see on the landscape in the Heather Moorlands, you see it's a kind of blueprint on the ground. It's rows of stones in the shape of long rectangles, and that gives you the shape of the longhouse. So that's what we look for. And you see other blueprints, the shapes of barns and outbuildings and corn drying kilns. So once you get your eye in, you kind of spot them everywhere.
A place that we wanted to excavate. We had a pilot community excavation, and we have I think about 6 different longhouses in this little township, and they're quite visible. Just you can see the footings of the longhouses and various other things that are associated with the township, like a corn drying kiln and tatty pits, are all still visible after 200 years. And so I became involved in the excavation recently, just a couple of weeks ago, and found myself cleaning a beautiful cobbled floor that was found in one of the longhouses. The archaeologists were delighted with all the finds after this excavation, and are very, very keen to see if they can find funding to extend this excavation, come back next year and do some more, or even a bigger study. We weren't really expecting to find too much, but I myself, when I was digging away, found something that was green and sharp, and I thought, oh, it must be a piece of a bottle, and it went on, and I was digging away and realised it was copper, and it was covered in rivets. So when it was dug out, it was a piece of a whisky still, or at least we think it is.
Well, as soon as you come into the door at Timespan here, you get a really lovely Highland welcome from the girls at the reception desk. We have a wonderful cafe. It's a riverside cafe, and in our cafe, as I say, our wonderful cafe staff will bake you wonderful homemade baking, soups, local dishes. It is just a feast for the eyes and for the taste buds. Our gift shop is just a wonderful place if you're looking for something just that little bit different to take back with you. Handmade crafts, that high quality jewellery, scarves, hats. It's just an amazing place. If you actually go into our museum, we also have reconstructions of a croft house, a late 19th century croft house, a smiddy, a blacksmith's, and that was a very key place in the village. That's where all the gossip and news was related to everybody. And would you even believe smiddies even pulled your teeth, cut your hair and married you? Well, the museum here is 26 years old. It started its life out as something the community had a willingness to put together to tell about the rich history of the area. Some of our artists in residence have included Carlin Leffley. Now, Carlin's exhibition realm is fascinating. It coincides with the excavation of some of the longhouses where the people were living before the clearances. But those croft houses in our landscapes now a lot of them are derelict. And Carlin has gone up to these croft houses and she has taken photographs of the houses during the process of becoming deteriorated. And then she superimposes upon that work outdoor scenes like forest scenes or running water. And it's quite fascinating. It's like bringing the outdoors indoors, and this whole idea of, it's like another world really. And it's quite fascinating.
Well, that's all we have on Prairie Pulse this week. And as always, thanks for watching.